today of the two scripture lessons, you got sort of like Thessalonians, work together, work hard, this will be good. And then you have the gospel that's just sort of like, oh, wow, that's terrifying. Right? And on first glance, they look like they have nothing to do with each other, right? But when you really dig into the gospel lesson and start to figure out what Jesus is getting at and what he's talking about, you realize that they're completely related. So let's start off there. Let's dig into that gospel lesson for a moment to give us an idea of not just what was going on at the time that Jesus said these predictions, but what occurs later. Now, some Christians will try to make this about end times and stuff like that, and I think they're wrong to do that. Because I think this isn't about some future date to us. This is about a past date to us, but future to the apostles. What do I mean? Well, Jesus says very clearly, he's standing in this temple, this amazing building, this building that had lasted generations. His apostles and anyone who heard him would have been like, well, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpappy went to school here. There's no way this building's coming down. It had been through wars and insurrections and all sorts of stuff. But you know, I know, they know, that any building that can be put up by humanity can be torn down by humanity, right? It's illogical to say any building out there will last forever. You may not know the time or the date, but every building collapses eventually, right? And yet, they stand there, they hear this, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the crowd, the apostles will hear all these things. We'll hear him say, when other people come claiming to be the Messiah, do not follow them. They will lead you to ruin. And yet, we know that historically, that is exactly what happens. After the apostles live and die and are exactly betrayed and thrown in front of governors and thrown in front of kings and mostly murdered, then will come an era a little bit later. And in that era, there's going to be two things. You can either call them civil wars or revolts. Historians will argue about it, but there are two wars that occur between the people of Israel and the Roman Empire. First revolt or civil war occurs. Rome is like, are you kidding me? Crushes the Jewish resistance, conquers the entire area, grabs everyone they think involved in the revolt, enslaves them and ships them across the empire and tells them, if you guys ever do this again, I will make this worse. The people of Israel, following another Messiah, who claims to be a military leader, has another revolt. Rome is like, well, I warned you folks, because that's what totalitarian dictatorships do. They came through, they killed everyone. Those they didn't kill, they enslaved, put across the empire. Then they took control of the temple, ripped everything of value out of it, melted it down, created commemorative coins with the ransacking of the temple, and required everyone in the area of Israel to use these coins as their only currency. Because that's how Rome worked. They then took one piece by piece by piece the temple down in front of everyone while they watched. Because that's how Rome worked. So everything Jesus said today would happen has already occurred. Rome took the food supplies too, so there was a mass famine. Again, that's Rome being Rome. But you may ask yourself, well, that's a fun history lesson, but what does it have to do with us and still not seeing the Thessalonian thing? Well, it's, I think, because of what occurred, the dynamics. Right? Jesus has one of these moments where he literally lays out, like, guys, if you do this, then horrible things are going to happen. And everyone went, yeah, Jesus, we hear you. And then we know they totally went ahead and did it anyways, and terrible things occurred, right? So you have to ask the question, why did they not hear Jesus? Why did they not hear what he said? Why did they not take his warning? Well, I think it's because they're standing in this beautiful, amazing temple, this wonderful gift from God that had withstanded so much and was so grand and so amazing that they became complacent. Deep down in their heart, even though they knew it was irrational, they thought to themselves, surely nothing I do could ever destroy something as amazing as this. Even if Jesus said, if I do it, we'll destroy it. And this is sort of a human thing, right? When things are really good and all is well, it is so easy for us to take a gift of God for granted. And when we start taking it for granted, all sorts of bad things start to happen. You ignore it, or you skim off of it, or corruption sets in, because after all, my little thing I'm doing won't affect the whole thing. Give you an example. When I go to seminary, it's just after the 09 decision, just after the 08 crash, okay? Put you in place and time here. So with the crash in 08 of the stock market, y'all remember that fun? All these pastors who were getting ready to retire were like, oh, I can't afford to do that now. And so retirements come to a complete abrupt stop, okay? At the same time, more churches left. Granted, it was only 3%, but more churches leave than pastors. So you have about 400 pastors who are of working age who stay with the ELCA, but their churches leave. Okay? So what do you have? A glut of pastors. You have more pastors than churches. First and only time in the ELCA history of having that for any length of time. Literally, if you wanted a pastor, you could have one in 09. Now, for us seminarians going to school about then, we ran into a little bit of a problem. Because what that meant is our professors knew that. And our professors were like, finally. Because what they knew is they could treat us however the heck they wanted. Because it didn't matter if we were around, because everyone was like, hey, I can't even place the seminarians are giving me. I remember most of our professors would talk to us and be like, hey, just so you know, all y'all, you're expendable. So you better be really, really good and really, really agree with everything, because if you're not, I can get rid of you. And no one's going to get mad at me because we have more pastors than we need. And I remember we complained to the administration, talked to the administration, we were like, hey, come on, this is like really awful. You realize like all the things that's creating the gluts are really temporary? Because stock markets go down, but they also go up. We don't know how or when or how many years it's going to be, but eventually all those folks waiting to retire are going to retire. And yeah, you have this little pocket of folks, but they'll eventually get redistributed in the system too. If you start going ahead and getting rid of seminarians willy-nilly, you're not going to have pastors, guys. And the response from administration was like, yeah, that's a very good argument. But there's always been enough pastors. It always works out. If we have a little bit of a shortage for a while, it will be fine. It always has worked out in the end. I mean, I don't know how when you make a really good argument, but yeah, don't worry about it. This is just this seminary. There are like 8 others. So, forward time, y'all know there's a horrible pastor shortage, right? Love to sit down and talk to some of those professors now. That is a good example of what I mean when you get complacent. It was good for them, and they ran that up, even if they were going to hurt the system, because they believed, you know what, the system will always hold. The system surely won't fall. The system surely won't falter. Surely there'll always be a seminarian. There's lots of places in our lives, lots of places as a community that can easily occur. And it most often starts to take its roots when things are really good. And that's why it's so hard to notice. Because the really goodness of that moment often overshadows the corruption, the complacency, or whatever. But this doesn't just exist on a community level, this can exist on an individual level too. How many of you all, especially if you're old enough, have ever known someone who got married to an amazing spouse, and at the beginning of their marriage, it was awesome? And that person realizes they have an amazing marriage. And instead of treasuring the marriage and feeding the marriage and keeping that strong relationship strong, they take the spouse for granted. Forward a decade, or maybe 2. Is that marriage still strong? Is that marriage still okay? Most likely not. Because you have this amazing gift of God, which is that spouse. And if you don't appreciate your spouse, in time, that gift falls apart. That relationship suffers, sometimes beyond being able to be repaired. This isn't just true with spouses. This can be true with your relationship with your parents or with your children or with your siblings or with your friends. I mean, we all have that friend we were super close to, 20 years ago, back when we were in whatever. And now they're just a Facebook friend and you don't even know their cat's name. Because we meant to keep up with them and life happened. That's part of what occurs, is we have these temples, these gifts, and if we don't appreciate them, if we aren't thankful for them, if we don't invest in them, stone by stone, often really quietly, they begin to fall apart. That's what Paul's talking about in Thessalonians, in the keep working, keep doing, keep showing up. Because the most of so many things, relationship or community or otherwise, is about showing up and really being there. That's like 90% of the battle. One more illustration to get what I mean on the community level. For 20 years, the U.S. government backed and tried to train the Afghan army, right? And stood there with the Afghans against totalitarian dictatorship. And the Afghan leadership, not the guys in the trenches, created fake soldiers, let corruption reign. And so when the Taliban came and the U.S. left, the 300,000 strong against 70,000 were mostly not existent. Because the leaders never thought the U.S. would leave, never thought Western support would end. And so when they had to stand on their own, they collapsed. We all witnessed that, like overnight. City after city fell. Because they never really believed that their nation was at risk. Forward to earlier this year, Ukraine. They had like 6 years of training from the West. Nowhere near as much money, nowhere near as much weapons, and a much harder foe. They've lasted a lot longer. Who knows how it will end? I'm no military or political expert, okay? You know what the big difference is? Ukraine knows that they could lose. They know the support doesn't last forever. Therefore, they're fighting. Now, it's not about politics, but it is about how this plays out in life. Because when you have the resources, when you have the time to prepare for whatever it is that's coming, you can either take it for granted, or you can suck every ounce out of that marrow. As you go out today, what I want you to do is take a few minutes in your life and ask yourself, what are my temples, the treasures and gifts that God has given me on a personal or communal level? And then ask, are you taking any of them for granted and fallen into complacency or disrepair? And if so, take some time this week to show up and be there. But that's always step one.